ladies and gentlemen. This is my last lecture. I get off tomorrow. I will miss everyone. I'm off to the Amsterdam, and this time I'm not lecturing. I'm meeting my grandson and two friends, and we're going around South America and all the way to Antarctica, and I'm a passenger. So I enjoy Hal, it's my favorite line, so I share it. This is a preparation for the Cape Verdes. What you just heard was the music called the Morna, and that was Cesara Evora, who died in 2011, and she traveled all over the world. That particular concert was in Paris. She's been all over the United States. In fact, my kids, when I first went to the Cape Verdes, I said, oh, I'm going to start my lecture with Cesara Evora. They said, oh, we just went to her concert, you know. So now you know, if you didn't know before, who she is, because she's an iconic cultural person of the Cape Verde Islands. The music genre called the Morna is a very sad type of song, and this song is called Saudade, and they speak not quite Portuguese, it's a Creole of Portuguese, and Saudade means nostalgia, and it is about the road from Sao Tome. Sao Tome, you know, is another island. There is no road, but the unemployment rate and the economic conditions in Cape Verde were always so bad that the men had to go and find jobs elsewhere, and they always had this feeling of nostalgia for their homeland. So that is what this song is about. And you can find it online and find it in other, you can look it up and you can hear it and hear some of her other songs as well. The music, there's also a family. I think they're called the Batista family on one of the islands. I think it's San Vicente. I'm not quite sure, but they make guitars. If you're going to be on that island, go and visit them, because they were quite famous, traveled Europe, and there were several brothers. They had a band, and they were very popular in Europe, and they suffered from saudade, homesickness. And they came back home, and now they make some of the most famous guitars that European professionals come to order and to buy. And they're just humble little shop, and you can, they'll give you a little tour and show you how they make these exceptional guitars. The Cape Verde Islands are volcanic. Most of them are flat. One is called Sal because it's a salt island, but the main island that has the volcano on it is called Fogo, fire, and it has erupted recently. It erupted in 1995. I was there after that eruption, but before the last eruption. They actually live up by the cone, and there's a school there. And when we went down, several of us went back down to town and bought school supplies because the children didn't even have enough paper, pencils, and that sort of thing. And then we came back up to the volcano and gave them, presented them to the school. So if you feel like it, if you're going to be on this island, which I'm not sure that the itinerary takes you here, but that this is from one of the whaling images, one of the whaling pictures. These people were whalers sailors and traveled all over the world. This is what the islands look like. They're off the coast of Senegal. The main island is Praia, and there's several smaller, flatter islands. Here up on the right, you see Fogo. You can see if I this. There it is. There's Fogo, which is the main volcano. These are a volcanic island, very similar to the Hawaiian Islands. They're simply a hole in the Earth's core that erupts every so often. These people who came to these islands didn't come here voluntarily. They were brought here by the Portuguese. Nobody inhabited these islands prior to the Portuguese settlement. The Portuguese decided that they were going to grow sugarcane on these islands, and of course, should they, being Portuguese and being the time that it was, free labor was the way to go. And they brought a bunch of slaves out here to work in the sugarcane fields. Well, the problem with these islands is that only 10% of the soil is arable or can grow anything. This is recent volcanic soil. It has not degraded yet. It has not become rich soil. And so what happened was that poverty ensued. And eventually the Portuguese just said, we're going to just move out of here. And they left. And they left these people on the islands. The islands then were exposed to piracy, and they suffered a series of droughts. The climate changed, it was deforested, the islands were deforested, and a series of droughts came along, and that caused starvation and poverty on the islands themselves. So starting in the 1700s, these people were stuck without any kind of food and without enough agriculture to survive, and they had to find another way to make a living. One of the islands, most of the islands are flat. One of the islands is a high island, and this is one of the towns that we visited. Up here, the road kind of zigzags up into this area. Those are natural terraces from the geology of the island, from the layers of eruption, but they also build artificial terraces to try to make agricultural production. They have a mix, their culture is a mix of Portuguese, African, and the Africans came from different parts of Africa. They were brought here as slaves, so their habits and their food production, their eating habits are very eclectic. What they call cachupa is really what we were talking about as fufu, and a combination of a stew with a carbohydrate, and they mix various kinds of ingredients. They consider this all a cuisine, very highly desirable cuisine. They love their food, and they serve it even here in the United States, where many of them have migrated to. In the past, there had these, this is a photographic collection from the turn of the century, the last century, 1900, when poverty was quite rampant on these islands. And these were matrifocal families. Because of the starvation, because of the droughts, the men had to seek work. And that is what Cesare Evora is singing about. The men would go to Sao Tome, to the coffee plantations, or later in the 1800s, they went whaling. And they would send money back. And what happened was that these people created an incredibly collaborative and cooperative society that takes care of each other. They're very communal. Most of them do not own land individually, they own land collectively, either as extended families or as groups of families, and they help each other out. Most of the island was inhabited by women and children, with the men coming and going because they were seeking jobs. And interestingly enough, in contrast to the way many other places with matrifocal families worked, these men were extremely responsible, and they sent money back, and they came back to take care of the families, the women, and the children. So what joblessness had essentially caused, it caused the inhabitants to be mainly female, and therefore the families were female-oriented, and the men would come in and out to the families. This is something that has been studied in Jamaica, but here you had a tremendous sense of return, and that's which is reflected in the music of the Mornas, that they return. And when they return, they take care of the children. Now, all of these men don't know that these children are theirs, because other men have been coming and going. But whoever is there, whichever woman is their woman, they will take care of the children. They simply adopt the children. It isn't formal adoption, but it is parentage, and 100% parentage. These people are known for their dedication to responsibility and family. And there are films, documentary films done about this, and I'll show you some of those. And this is still from the photojournalists. In the 1800s, whaling started to develop, and the whaling was coming out of New Bedford, Massachusetts, and the local men started to find jobs in the whaling industry. And they were highly sought after because, one, they didn't have to be paid the same as everybody else. They were willing to take less because for them it was necessity, exploitation of a certain type. The other thing was that they were responsible. They didn't go off drinking and carousing. They stayed and they worked, and they were very, very hard workers. And not only did they work, but eventually they saved enough money to buy the ships. So what you ended up in New Bedford, a lot of them brought their families over there and to Rhode Island. There's two major communities of whalers, and a lot of them owned the ships and hired other Cape Verdeans to work on those ships. And this is one, they settled on Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, which nobody can afford to settle on these days. But then they got into the whaling industry, and they did bring their families over. They brought the women over, and they brought the children over, and they set up schools, and they set up clubs, boys' clubs, girls' clubs, ladies' clubs of various kinds. Still left behind in parts of, tucked away in parts of the Cape Verdes, are communities of the people they called the Rebeldes. These were people who ran away from slavery long ago, and they still live in little communities off by themselves, and they're sort of have a hermit-like existence, although they're slowly disappearing and getting integrated in the society. These people you will recognize. You recognize Frederick Douglass. He was a whaler. He worked with the Cape Verdeans at one time. And then there was Paul Cuff. There are many distinguished Cape Verdeans who got educated and became writers And there are several filmmakers, and I'll show you some of the films that, about the films that they made. Paul Cuff was actually owned or purchased by a Quaker family, and the Quakers didn't believe in slavery, so he was let go. He eventually worked on a whaling ship, and then he purchased the ship, and he became the captain and the owner, and he started sailing back and forth to the Cape Verdes, bringing food to the Cape Verdes and hiring them to work for him. The Cape Verdeans are quite literate, as a people in general have been, and as soon as they could learn to read and write, they took the opportunity to do so, and they have an archive. And the archive collects their individual histories, and it has been now made into a documentary film, and this guy is talking about the fact that about his grandfather, the whaler. This is the typical type of personal stories that are in the Cape Verdean archive. The problem when they came to the United States, they did not fit into any society, and this has been to them a struggle. To this day, it remains a struggle. They are not classified with Afro-Americans, and they're not classified with whites. They are mixed, and they consider themselves separate. They consider their society a total cultural entity. So where are the borders of that society? Who determines the borders? Do the people themselves determine who they are and where the border is, or do the people outside? Well, in the United States, it tends to be the people outside who decide who you are. The Americans are very good about defining other people. So they have been defined as really non-existent. And this is something that has spurred them on to make a whole series of documentaries and to write about their past and about their history. And they lived in Rhode Island. They settled in Fox Point, and another community was in New Bedford. And in these communities, they created their own society because they felt that they were outside of the American mainstream, not having no special position within that society, so they made their position. And this is a school. They ran their own schools, they ran their own clubs, they had social clubs, and eventually they had their own academic institutions.
We have exposed our culture to a community that didn't know we existed. I didn't grow up in a Cape Verdean community. I was aware of my Cape Verdean roots, but never really celebrated it.
There wasn't enough information out there on Cape Verdeans. The Cape Verdean experience on the West Coast is less known.
Yes, we've been invisible. Yes, we're a small demographic. But throughout the centuries, we've always been connected through our network of kinship.
When you look at the history of Cape Verde, they were brought to the islands from the mainland as indentured servants or slaves.
The Cape Verde Islands had been experiencing recurrent drought, ensuing famine for decades. It was very difficult to survive.
I don't think that we are all readily embraced by Africans because we are still part European.
I really started to appreciate how bold our grandparents were to get in those little ships and come across the Atlantic to take a chance as to what was happening.
You have a slight accent, where are you from? And I get that a lot. So I told her, I'm from these tiny little islands off the west coast of Africa.
I'm a Cape Verdean in California, but I really became a Cape Verdean in California.
This is what my parents taught me, and this is what it means to be Cape Verdean.
Music has been kind of a unifying force, has kept us together. We have a very big tradition.
This is the filmmaker. They were met by President Obama and they have made the film Proud to be a Cape Verdean. This is just one of the documentaries that have been made by Cape Verdeans about their experience. The migration, when they started migrating into the United States, as always, it was not an easy process, because first you had the men coming here. The men were part of the whaling industry. The women were behind, and the men were isolated in New Bedford and in Fox Point in the United States, and they were isolated. But slowly they started to bring their families over. As soon as they could save up their money, they brought their families over. And they started working in the cotton fields, and they were classed with the African Americans, and they were segregated against exactly as the African Americans were, because they were considered colored in those days. But at the same time, they were very much involved in business, and because they had one leg in a homeland, they still had their homeland, they could always escape if they made enough money. And because they helped each other, and because they were communal people, because they shared a language and a culture, they were able to unify and to create a unified community. And they started to buy the ships, the whaling ships. When whaling started to decline, they converted those ships to packets and started bringing people from the Cape Verdes over. And here they were bringing the women and the children and charging other people. They were going to other places as well and making money on these ships. They learned shipping, and they could refit the ships and rebuild them. And this picture is kind of interesting, because this is the way I came to America. I was 7 when we came to America, very much in this kind of environment for 17 days from Athens to New York. So they started to refit the ships, and the ships then started to bring people and charge people for coming over. And as they would charge and they would make the money, they also ended up forming communities, solid communities in the United States. And the two communities that were formed were Fox Point in Rhode Island, and there was a smaller community in New Bedford. Eventually, Fox Point became the main community. And they had their, the last whaling voyage of the Wanderer, which, the ship called the Wanderer was in 1924. After that, it was wrecked, but whaling had already declined, and now it was passenger travel. As you know, that the First World War had ended in Europe, and there were and the Russian Revolution had taken place, so there were a lot of people displaced in Europe that were coming to the United States, and this was a good time for them to provide this kind of service and they had to go through Ellis Island. When the women were brought over, when the women came, the jobs that were first available to them was cranberry picking. They worked in the cranberry bogs of New England, and this picture has the big guy who probably owns the cranberry field watching over the Cape Verdean women who were picking cranberries. But they did not stay very long in this type of menial labor. They very quickly adapted to the conditions, and the women changed their roles. The women started to take on, they went to get education, and they started to take on the leadership roles because, of course, the men were still working on ships. So even though they were now in the United States, the men were traveling back and forth. But they were all keeping their close tie to the original homeland, to Cape Verde. And every time there was a drought or famine in Cape Verdes, they supplied food, even when they had very little to offer. So they kept a very close tie with the homeland. This is a women's group. The women became quite prominent, and they became middle class, and eventually they became quite well off, and they were centered in and around Fox Point on Rhode Island. This is a women's club and a women's group that ran the community and kept the educational system and kept the children going to school and then going on to university and getting themselves educated. The men were involved in several very interesting and very famous expeditions and with very well-known ships. This one went back and forth, and that was to the Cape Verde Islands, and it had a constant route from New England to the Cape Verdes, bringing supplies, bringing food, and bringing back people into the U.S. Because at that time, the U.S. had fairly open borders, and you didn't have to get, the visa process wasn't like it was today. They bought the whaling ships and they converted them. And the Ernestina is one of the ships that was converted several times. It became actually one of the research ships that went to the North Pole, and they got within 600 miles, I believe, of the North Pole itself. It was part of the polar expedition of 1930. It was called the Morrissey at that time. Later it was purchased by a Cape Verdean captain and his family and became one of the Cape Verdean ships. Here's the Ernestina in the polar expedition in 1930 and in the ice. The society within Cape Verde is fairly structured and fairly stratified. They have a system where they have different classes. Even though it's a small society, it has classes, and they're almost castes. People marry within their socioeconomic standard, and they keep together with those other people, but they're helping each other within those strata, so that the whole strata rises. When one group rises, the whole group rises economically in status. They're also very much involved in international activities. They're very visible people, and they have been involved in sports, and of course you saw in music, they're world class. Their music is world class. They have a number of festivals which they invite you to if you'd like to go to one of their music festivals at the time when they will present new groups, and they push the young people forward and will showcase the groups. They also have a very strong tie with Brazil. And Brazil, of course, music in Brazil is very important, and Cape Verdean music is always showcased in Brazil in the competitions. And this is one of the young ladies who won a competition in Brazil some years ago it has become quite well known. There are many Cape Verdeans who are very well educated. And this is another documentary that came out recently. This woman teaches at Brown University, and she has put together a documentary on the history and the identity, the seeking of identity. That seems to be the sort of leitmotif of the Cape Verdeans, is who are we, how we define ourselves, and how do we interact with a larger society within this new world in the United States. And how do we bring in the people who are left behind, who are in Cape Verde themselves. They are part of our community. But the tragedy of it all is that in 1970, and she writes about this in her documentary, we had a program in the United States called Urban Renewal. And urban renewal was basically a way of dissipating and dispersing minority communities and communities of poor people and settling them anywhere but where they were. And I went to University of Pennsylvania, and there was a community right outside of the university because a lot of the students lived in that community. That's where they could afford housing, and that community also fell to urban renewal. Fox Point was dismantled by law in 1970. And she writes about that, about how it was a concerted effort to break up this very tight community that was self-sufficient and to disperse it. And the dispersal was successful. And it was a very, to the Cape Verdeans, they have tried to stay together, they have tried to maintain cultural and social ties, but it has been a challenge since they don't have their schools and their communities. And this documentary is the story of them from coming from Cape Verde, what happened from the Cape Verdes all the way to the effects of urban renewal. And up there you can see the map of New Bedford and the Rhode Island area where they lived. The Cape Verdeans that you will meet get assistance. They live on remittances. The remittances are very important for their livelihood and for their survival. It is considered up to 20% of the budget of the country comes from remittances. I would guess that it's probably more. When you see these blue barrels, has anyone ever seen these blue barrels anywhere? You haven't looked. You see them in Central America, you see them in Belize, you see them in Africa, you see them everywhere. That is what the relatives are sending clothes in. They buy these barrels and they stuff them with clothes. Goodwill now sells clothes by the barrel in Minneapolis. You can buy a whole barrel full of clothes, and the Minneapolis people that I know will gather these barrels, gather the clothes, rent a truck, and then drive it down to Belize to give this to their families. And locally they use some of it and some of it they sell. This is their support system. And I've seen these blue barrels in South America. I've seen them all over the world. So keep your eyes open. You will see them in different places. This is very important. So this is what you will see in Cape Verde. You will see a very kind, very gentle people. I have never felt any threats. I've never felt uncomfortable in the islands. It is not a dangerous situation. Always keep your wits about you, but it is not a dangerous situation. They are very friendly, gentle, kind people, very hospitable. And if you can communicate with them in their Portuguese, which is a Creole Portuguese, do so, and some of them speak English, but they are intricately tied to the communities in the United States with whom they interact and upon whom they depend, and the community in the United States